Let me say a big thank you to all of you joining us by way of our telecast. Welcome to the Methodist Connection. This program is designed for you and with you in mind. The global ambassador of Methodist Heritage Sites is with us today. It is indeed a great privilege to have with us David Worthington. David is joining us from the famous city of Bristol. And I surmise, David, you must be probably are you at the New Room?
Well, I actually work from home, as of course many people do these days, but I was the director at John Wesley's New Room for 16 years, and I still retain a role as a global ambassador for the New Room, which means that I often give talks and host groups when they come to the New Room, and we share the story regarding John and Charles Wesley and the development of the early Methodist movement in the city of Bristol.
It's a great privilege to have you with us, David. Methodist history is deeply rooted in what John Wesley called the connection. Methodists everywhere in the world and around the world share this particular history. And I vividly remember not too long ago, was in London and also in Bristol. I had the opportunity to have met with you, talk to you as a pilgrim from Western Pennsylvania. Methodist history is quite unique, and you are a scholar of Methodist history, and that's the reason why we've been in conversation even before I departed Bristol. That there was a need to be able to engage with you. You are hardly sought out. You travel all the time, and you just came from here. When you were here in the U.S., we communicated, and then you said when you're going to get back to Bristol, we could find a way to be able to engage with you. Many of our viewers and our listeners who are joining us today, as we welcome you in this Methodist conversation. This is where we discuss issues within the context of Methodism and be able to bring awareness to people who are United Methodists, people who are Methodists, people who have the Wesleyan root,
Yep.
that Wesleyan history that is deeply sacred. And our church is at a pivotal time, a changing time. So as we have you here, it is indeed a great privilege that we can have you so that we can be able to go through some of these challenging issues. But let's look at the New Room. In its very early beginnings, John, a determined man of faith, with the encouragement of a friend, George Whitfield. I started to reflect after we had a conversation in Bristol during our recent visit, what friends can do and that particular connection. And I started to deduce, and I'm like, okay, I think I genuinely understand now this whole aspect of what the Methodist connection is. And even the hospitality that we receive while visiting Britain, whether it was in Peel or it was at Epworth, it was at the Wesley Chapel, it was at the New Room, and on to Oxford and even the Wesley Chapel on City Road in London itself. That Methodist hospitality, that camaraderie, that particular engagement of wherever you see Methodists, it is truly authentic. Talk to us about the early beginnings of this particular, the oldest building that we went to, which is the new room, the oldest building, Methodist building in the world.
Yes, it's a very grand title, the oldest Methodist building in the world. It dates from 1739. And you've mentioned some of the places which, of course, are very significant in the life of John and Charles Wesley. Epworth, the boyhood home for the two brothers. London, of course, where both of them received schooling. Oxford, where they both were at Christ Church, where they did their degrees. Bristol is a city which is located 120 miles west of London. And in that sense, it wasn't a city which, up until John's arrival in 1739, he previously visited. It, however, was a very significant city in the kingdom. It was the second city, both in terms of population and influence, and particularly trade. Bristol is a trading city. It's a maritime city. It faces westwards, and many of the early American imports that came in from the colonies, things like cotton and tobacco from the West Indies, with rum and sugars, for example, came in through the port of Bristol. So it was a very significant city, and that's why initially George Whitefield began to preach in the open air in Bristol, and then subsequently, of course, Whitefield invites his friend from Oxford, John Wesley, to come to the city to continue the work which he has begun. A very radical ministry. Both John and George, as well as Charles, of course, were ordained Anglican ministers. They were ministers in the Church of England. And in that sense, they were criticized heavily for their willingness to, as John wrote in his journal, be more vile, to go and preach in the open air. The church's view at that time was that if you wanted to hear the word of God being preached, you needed to come in to the house of God. And so the Wesley brothers and Whitefield were very heavily criticized for their willingness to go out and share the word where the people were. So it was, in some respects, a very practical response to the fact that many Anglican churches refused these men access to their pulpits, that they said, well, we will go and preach where the people are. And so John preaches for the first time in the open air on the 2nd of April, 1739. He preaches a short distance, about 5-10 minutes from the new room, a site called the Brickfields in Bread Street. And he preaches in the open air for the first time. And in that sense, I think it's a very significant moment in the life of John Wesley, because, of course, if you ask folks around the world if they know anything at all about John Wesley, it would be most likely that they know of him as an outdoor preacher. And so that journey begins in the city of Bristol, and, of course, continues then for the rest of John's life through until his death in 1791. So the new room is a very significant building because it not only represents the oldest Methodist building, but in many respects, many of the elements which we have come to know connected with Methodism. So, for example, the establishment of class meetings, of bands and society, of membership. Again, all of those were first introduced at the new room. Wesley, of course, also used it very much as a place where the social gospel was lived out. So he responded to many of the early people that he engaged with who wanted access to healthcare, to education, to support. So it wasn't just about saving souls. It was also about dealing with the practical day-to-day issues that people had in their lives. And I think that's why many people responded to the early Methodists. Not only were they preaching the word, they were living it. And I think that the lives of John and Charles and George, and of course many, many others, were examples of how they were living a life that was focused on serving Christ.
And I think from this recent visit, for me, coming to England, and seeing the volume of work that John, Charles, and the whole Methodist movement is associated with. The Methodist connection genuinely, it speaks profoundly to it. If you are able to visit all of these areas and see the work that John, Charles, and all of those great saints who've gone before us, I think we can learn from this. There are many Methodists who are quite indeed not aware about this tremendous history. And it is this very Methodist connection that is bringing us together today as we have this conversation, David.
I would absolutely agree with what you've just shared there. And I think that I reflect on the words that Bishop Tom Bickerton used when he offered his State of the UMC address last year, when he at that time was chair of the Council of Bishops. He encouraged Methodists to reclaim our identity as Methodists. What does it mean to be a Methodist? What is different to being a Methodist to maybe another denomination? And I think what stands out for me is not only a sense in which you need to understand your Bible and to live a life that's reflective of Christ's teaching, but I think it's also about seeking to engage with the poor, the disenfranchised, the hard to reach, the difficult to engage with. I'm sure both John and Charles, based on their education, could have lived relatively comfortable lives in the world of academia in Oxford University, for example. But both of them, I think, realized that God was calling them to a different path, a different role. And in that sense, they went out and engaged with people where they were, as opposed to expecting the people to come to them. And I think that's a very brave and radical thing to do. And in that sense, I think that what the Wesleys did in the 18th century still has a lot to teach us about the way in which we should be doing church today. I think there are some important, challenging, but important discussions to be had about, well, how do we go about our lives and ministries today? I often quote that many churches on their notice boards or on their websites will talk about all are welcome. But the reality is that for many people coming into a church, particularly if they have no background or understanding about the liturgy of the church, will find it a very strange and potentially intimidating place to be. When do I stand up? When do I sit down? When do I kneel? What's communion about? You're talking about body and blood. You're offering me a wafer. You're offering, I think for those who are not, if you like, steeped in the church, those can be very strange and bewildering things to be approached with. So I think there is something to be said for trying to cut through some of the mystique about what we do on Sundays in church. And in that regard, I think that we do need to, like the Wesleys did in the 18th century, think about how we submit to be more vile. And that can be obviously interpreted in lots of different ways. But I think what it's encouraging us to do is to be willing to change, and to accept that maybe the way we've done things before and up to this point have not achieved the objectives that we would like them to. And on that basis, we do need to think about how we are changing. We could go in on ourselves and bemoan the fact that we live in a post-Christian world, that people are not interested in religion anymore, and that we have nothing to say. And I think if you take that view, then, well, to put it bluntly, let's close the whole thing down and walk away. But I don't think that is the message that we as followers of Christ should be sending. I think that, yes, we are living in challenging times. Many would argue that every time in history has its challenges. And I think we've just got to think more creatively about the ways in which we go about engaging with people, I'm always fascinated when people are asked, do you consider yourself religious? How many people are very turned off by that phrase and do not define themselves as being religious. And yet, if you ask the question with a slightly different wording, do you consider yourself to be a spiritual person? Very often there is a very positive response to that. And I think that that's something for us. Yes, we are offering religion, but I think that we have perhaps got our traditions and our institutional thinking ahead. Ultimately, what we should be seeking to do is to, as the UMC mission statement talks about, of course, which is that, the creation of disciples for the transformation of the world. And that's a very bold statement to make. It isn't just about change, it's about transformation. And to put it bluntly, if we're not prepared to embrace that mission statement in its wholeness, if we're just about, well, I'm willing to change, that's as far as I'm prepared to go, then I think to some extent we are going to fail before we've even begun, because we're not embracing what our mission statement says, which is that we are seeking to transform the world. So there are some big ideas and some big challenges, but I hope that through our existing networks, through church and of course other events that we attend, that people will begin to see that there are different ways in which we can do church and be church. And I would encourage people to think about how what they do might bring others into an environment that perhaps they might have up till that point thought, that's not for me. Because again, I think it's very clear when you ask most Christians how they come to faith, the vast majority will reply it's because of a personal relationship. It's an individual which has brought them to Christ, has to some extent shown them the way and allowed them to explore the ideas about what it means to be a Christian, and that they've then responded to that. So we have a huge responsibility on our shoulders, but I think, with God's grace, we can deliver what we should be delivering.
That is so true. And those of you who just joined us, we want to welcome you to the Methodist Connection. This is where we discuss everything that is rooted deeply in Methodism. And my special guest today happens to be David Worthington. David is joining us from Bristol in the United Kingdom. David is the global ambassador of Methodist Heritage Sites. And just as he mentioned earlier, he managed the activities of the New Room for over 16 years. Incredible history about the New Room and the services they render since 1739. The spiritual aspect is something that I just wanted to touch on briefly. Via preaching, the determinative spirit of John taking a full step, irrespective of the odds, and even the way he was shown by a bulk of those within the Church of England, the Anglican community, depriving him of preaching in these churches. The reality of the matter is that John was deeply spiritual, but John's intent was not to walk away from the Anglican community or from the Church of England. I think all of what he did was intended to complement, especially within the spiritual context. Am I getting that wrong, David?
No, I would agree with you. I think that Wesley, in that sense, remained an Anglican throughout his life. I think John's frustration was that he wanted to hopefully find a way to bring those involved with the Methodist movement to be part of the Church of England. John, because of his upbringing, of course, as the son of a Church of England minister, was very familiar and loved the traditions of the Anglican Church. But I think it's one thing to love the traditions. It's another thing to say, but how are those impacting on people and their lives today? And I think what Wesley recognized, that whilst he had a personal love of Anglican traditions and the church, that there were many people who, of course, had not had that upbringing. And as a result, he needed to find new ways to engage with them. So I think there are parallels with the challenges that within the Methodist Church we face today. I'm sure that there are many elements of church worship, of church membership that we are very comfortable with. And yet I suspect most would agree that we have not seen growth, we've not seen revival for many years. And I think that therefore is calling us to question the ways in which we have been doing, quote, church up to this point, and maybe considering ways in which those can change in order to bring about change in a wider society. I think there's a great danger that what we end up doing is repeating the mistakes that we've made in the past. And of course, this ties into my role with heritage, that, you know, I think that you do need to understand your past in order to envision your future. That's what the General Commission for Archives and History references on its website, that you need to understand the past to envision the future. Are we in danger, if we don't understand our past, of making the same mistakes that others have made and finding ourselves again struggling to understand why it is that people are not responding in the way that they have in previous generations? Now, I don't believe that necessarily means that we adopt exactly the same methods that the Wesleys or Whitefield adopted. I'm not saying that we have to go and stand on a street corner and preach. That may be, but I think there are other ways in which we need to think about how we engage with people and offer them a way to engage with us. And that's one of the reasons I believe that our heritage sites give us that opportunity. I know through my work at the New Room that we're welcoming thousands of people into that building every year. And people are often coming in with a natural curiosity. What is this building? Who was involved with this building? Why is it significant? Does it have any relevance to my life today? Now, those are challenging questions. And I think that if you get the opportunity to engage with people on those questions, admittedly, they might not come away and say, absolutely agree with everything that you've just shared with me, David, but at least you've had an opportunity to engage with them. I think too often we are waiting for people to come through our doors on a Sunday for a service, and the reality is that they don't come, we think they're not interested. I think that's the wrong conclusion. I think that it's not that they're not interested, it's not that we're finding a way to engage with them on their terms. And I think that's the challenge for the church moving forward, in the way that the Wesleys rose to that challenge in the 18th century. How do I find a way to share my faith, my love of Jesus, in a way that responds to people in their hearts and their heads? That's what the Wesleys did. And in that sense, I think that's the challenge that each one of us face today.
And then truly, we have to meet people where they are, to be the church. The Wesleys did, just as David indicated. Those of us who are Methodists, we have to take the church to the people, to be able to share the story, to tell the story about Jesus, who Jesus is, what has Jesus done in our lives, what transformation has come. If we are taxed with that responsibility for making disciples for the greater transformation of the world, then the reality of the matter is we have to take the cross and follow Christ by engaging people, sharing the good news of Jesus Christ meeting them where they are, telling the stories about Christianity and the significant role it has played and perhaps continue to play in our lives. And I think that is a key point, David, you have mentioned. It's quite interesting that you could afford us the time today that we could be able to talk to you. And I know you are a pretty busy man. I want to make sure that we respect the time, that we can do this in 30 minutes. I'm looking forward to a time, a place, through the power of technology, that we can have you with us on the Methodist Connection from time to time. And maybe in the future, we are hoping that we can introduce a telephone system that people can be able to raise some genuine questions. And you on the other side of the Atlantic will be able to talk to us. But I want to use this opportunity, David, to say a big thank you. Before we take a leave, we wrap up this program, talk to us a little bit. You are now global ambassador of Methodist heritage sites. You tour the world. You go to lots and lots of places. You have just returned from the U.S. And I do remember many, many years ago when I met you, when then I was just a scholar at the seminary at Drew University. It's a place you visit often. Huge Methodist archive there.
Yes.
The Madison campus of Drew University. Talk to us a little bit about what that engagement is as global ambassador of Methodist heritage sites.
So I was appointed into this role in May of this year. The primary responsibility is for preserving and promoting the significance of the United Methodist Church's heritage landmarks and historic sites. The majority of these are located in the United States. There are 500 Methodist historic sites and 50 heritage landmarks. And what I'm doing is essentially trying to raise awareness of these locations, because what I feel very animated and excited by is how we use our heritage as a form of mission. That by telling the stories associated with these sites, it gives us the opportunity to introduce the story not just of John Wesley, but of course many other of the saints that have gone before us. Of course, significant stories involving men and women, of white people, of black people. We must not forget that today the World Methodist Council represents 75 million Methodists around the world, and it truly is a global denomination. So I think it's important that we look at the heritage which we've been blessed with, both here in England, and we've mentioned some of the sites, for example, London, Oxford, Bristol, Epworth. But one of the things which I think in the United States I'm encouraging folks to think about is the ways in which some of the sites in the US have great significance and need to be celebrated. Some of the sites in London or Philadelphia or Baltimore, down in Savannah, of course. And every church, as soon as it opens its doors for the first time, begins at that point to become part of that story of Methodism. So I think for me, there are 5 main elements to what I do. One is many of these locations do not have worshipping congregations. And in that sense, I'm seeking to raise awareness in order to generate funds. And I do that through public speaking. I do that through hosting tour groups in Bristol, but also undertaking research as well, uncovering some of the stories that I think are then worth sharing. Because ultimately, I do see myself very much in the sort of Wesley for England or Francis Asbury for America, very much an itinerant preacher going around sharing the word because I believe that it's through that we will begin to see revival again. But I think that we do need to understand what it means to be a Methodist. Why is this story significant? Why is it worth retelling? And ultimately, what are we going to do with it? And what I mean by that is that I think it's important that we recognize that there are many Wesleyan scholars around the world, and many will put their own individual interpretation on how they understand Wesley and the Wesleyan way. I think it's important that the United Methodist Church continues to speak its voice as to how it interprets Wesleyan theology and how it believes that the Wesleyan way, the Methodist way, is still relevant to our lives today. So referencing back to Bishop Tom Bickerton, there were three elements to his State of the UMC address. The first one I referenced a little earlier, which was to reclaim our identity as Methodists. And I think that's where you need to understand your past. That's where you need to understand your heritage, your history. He goes on, the second one, he talks about revival of our passion for making disciples. You know, what is it that we do to try and share what I hope is our passion? You know, we believe that we have a story that we want to tell and we want to share. Ultimately, Jesus, I would say, is the world's best storyteller.
Oh,
you know,
yes.
That's why people came. That's why people came, because they love to hear the stories. And of course, he uses the parables as a way to introduce some very, deep messages. But, the stories need to be told. And the third point that the bishop makes is renewing our commitment to ministry and mission. And I think you touched on this a little earlier, which is that it is true to say that the United Methodist Church, particularly over the last few years with disaffiliation, has really not been able, I think, to focus on ministry and mission in a way that it, I hope, will now want to do. Instead, I think it's been too inward looking in terms of trying to address some very practical problems. But ultimately, disaffiliation is something which I hope is now behind us, and therefore that we do need to renew our commitment to ministry and mission. Because ultimately, again, to quote John Wesley, the Bible knows nothing of solitary religion. And I think what John is saying there is that, you cannot talk about, my faith in sort of isolation from everything that goes on around you. If you think that all is well with you and your God, but that you have no need to try and engage with other people, then, to put it bluntly, all is not well with you and your God, because your God is telling you, you need to go out, you need to make disciples, you need to be involved in mission. And I think if you find yourself thinking all is well with me and my God, then that to me would then be a red flag that says, and that's why you do need to renew your commitment to ministry and mission. So I hope that through sharing the stories associated with the historic sites and the heritage landmarks, that we are doing mission through heritage. I think it allows people to engage in a much more sort of neutral capacity. In other words, I think one of the reasons why many people are not coming into a church is because they are concerned about what welcome they might receive. They're just not quite sure what the church does. Whereas a heritage site allows you to come in and ask the questions on your terms. And I think that's a very important first step. It allows people to at least, if you like, just test the temperature of the water before they start to make a commitment about getting into a more sort of deeper sort of questioning about it. So, I believe that there is a reason why many of the American Methodist heritage landmarks have remained within the UMC following disaffiliation. And of course, why many of the sites here in England, in Oxford, Epworth, London, and of course, Bristol. Why are these buildings still here? Well, because I believe that we are being challenged to use those sites and those buildings for a purpose. You've probably heard me say before, and forgive me if you have, but I think it's a great way to hopefully conclude, which is that reflect on the parable of the talents. One is often reminded that the master goes away not with a view to having the talent buried and then dug back up again and presented back to him. Instead, the challenge is, how do I use the talent to grow and enhance what it is that I've been given? And I think that that's a good challenge for us to live by. What is it that I am doing that will actually, hopefully, enable this talent, this gift, to be used for God's greater glory? And I think that if we can find a way to do that, then I think that we are on that path that we should be on. And just one final quote, which I wanted to share with you, because to me, it's the Wesleyan theology almost in one paragraph. Shortly after John Wesley's arrival in Bristol in 1739, he received a letter from the Bishop of Bristol. And the bishop was most concerned about John being in the city. He said, "You have no commission to be in my diocese, and my best advice to you, therefore, is to go." Well, John Wesley, being John Wesley, of course, didn't write back politely and say, "Thank you for that advice, I'll be getting out of town tomorrow." He instead stood his grounds and, of course, came up with a quote which will be familiar to many who are listening and watching us. And he said, "I look upon all the world as my parish."
That's correct.
And he goes on, and I think these words are worth sharing, because I think these are so challenging. You know, he goes, "Thus far I mean that in whatever part of it I am, I judge it meet, right, and my bounden duty to declare unto all that are willing to hear the glad tidings of salvation. This is the work which I know God has called me to, and sure I am that his blessings attend it. Great encouragement, therefore, have I to be faithful in fulfilling the work he hath given me to do." You know, I can't find better words than, you know, how are we being faithful in fulfilling the work that God has given us to do?
Yeah.
John was very clear that the itinerant open-air preaching ministry was the work which God had given him to do, and he was faithful in delivering that ministry for over 50 years. And I suppose the question that each of us have to ask ourselves is, am I doing the work that God has given me to do? And if we are, then all power to you, brother, all power to you, sister. You carry on and you do that work. But if you don't have that clarity, then I think that's a moment for you to say, "God, guide me. Tell me, how do I get to that state where I am fulfilling the work that you're giving me to do?" From a personal point of view, I believe that, having served at the New Room for 16 years, that this is a work that God has given me to do. So I am seeking to be faithful in fulfilling what God has given me to do.
What a powerful word. We come to the end of this edition of the program, the Methodist Connection. David Worthington joining us from Bristol in England, and my colleague always call it the United Kingdom. And John says it best in this last words: the best of all is God is with us. And in the midst of all that we do, as David has indicated, we have that responsibility, the call of ministry, to be able to take the cross, to follow. And that talent that David is talking about is not about scarcity. It's about abundance. And how so much that God has given us. You see, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees the poor little widow who put in 2 coins, and those who were pontificating and playing all around in God's house in the synagogue, pretending to be showing off that they were giving so much in doing the work in the ministry of Jesus Christ. And I think with conviction, David, as you have indicated, from this trip that we've returned from in England, many of us, I in particular, are truly convicted, and we'll continue to commit ourselves. There is a revival that is taking place here within the context of where we are in Western Pennsylvania, not only with our congregation, but also with the ministerial group of churches that we work with here, irrespective of our Methodism, but also keeping in mind within the context of the Christian connection, that we all come to faith through Jesus Christ, whether you are a Presbyterian, you are a Lutheran, and this aspect of community organizing, as John did it so well. I'm hoping that next time when we talk to you, we can be able to talk much more deeper, not only about John, but be able to talk about Charles, the role he played, be able to talk about Samia, be able to talk about Susanna, and the list goes on and on. I'm very fascinated by this connection, and I think it's a blessing, David, to have you, or to have had you with us today. And it was an act of providence that we came in contact many, many years ago on campus at Drew. And it just goes to show how this Methodist connection is indeed a blessing, that no matter where you are as a United Methodist, today we are together. You are all the way there in Bristol. And by the power of technology, I'm here in Western Pennsylvania. Yeah, we are having a frantic and an authentic conversation about the Methodist Church, United Methodist, depending on wherever you are, global denomination, 75 million communion all over the world, people who are bringing about the greater transformation of the world. I want to thank you so much, Dave. It's been a great pleasure. We've kept you almost to 40 plus minutes now. So I'm going to save that time, hoping that next time I will be in touch.
Yeah.
By way of email and communication. But we want to thank our viewers for being a part of this particular edition of the Methodist Connection. On that note, we want to wrap up. My name is Zizi Pata, thanking you so much. And our special guest has been David Worthington, Global Ambassador of Methodist Heritage Sites, all the way from Bristol.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you. Thank you.
Me too. It's been a great pleasure, and we want to thank you for being with us today.
That's fine. Thank you.
I will talk to you on the other side, David, in just a minute.
Okay.